We still good to go, guys? Just give me a thumbs up and I'll dig right in. Okay, good. Okay, great. All right, so tonight, this is our final chapter on the Canaan Conquest. This is, of course, has been some of my favorite portions of the book, partly because one of the reasons for me that the Canaan Conquest is so sweet is that this is the period of time where all scholars unanimously pretty much agree that Israel's history, as recorded in the book of Judges or in the First Samuel, did not really occur as Scripture says that it does. But when we go back to the biblical chronology, as we will continue to see this evening, when we go back to the archaeology, when we go back to all of those elements that are in Scripture, and we compare it with what we know both from archaeology and history, we find that there is incredible cogency, as incredible parallels between the two, and that the dates actually match. So this is going to be fun tonight. So I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to go right to my slides tonight. All right, I'm going to wait for it to come up so you guys can see what I am seeing. And this is giving me a little bit, okay, you guys have it, great. All right, so this, of course, is the book club. And we are going to cover from Gideon to David. Oh, so glad you guys made it. Dave and Orlando, Sylvia, Sue, and Horace. So glad all you guys are here. All right. So when we look at this time period, and let me tell you where we are beginning. Last week, we really kind of concluded looking at Deborah and her scribes. And now we are transitioning into Gideon, who is also known as Yerubbaal. So one of the things that we find in the Merneptah sale, because Merneptah, who succeeded Pharaoh Ramesses II, or Ramses the Great, oh, so glad you're here too, Betty. Fantastic. When Merneptah succeeded his father, he was a very old man. And we find a lot of overlap between the judgeship of Deborah and that of Gideon. At least we find it literary. There are a lot of parallels between both what Deborah and her scribes wrote, as well as the accounts within Judges 6. One of the first things that we discover is that there is a famine that ravages the Levant. The next thing that we find is that there's a 7 years of captivity of raiding by the Midianites and the Amalekites prior to Gideon coming and being a judge within Israel. Oh, Ken, so glad you made it as well. Great to see you guys here. So the next thing that we find is that Merneptah tells us in his stele that the treaty that they had made with his father, remember they had concluded this treaty right around 1275 BCE, that the Hittites had called upon this treaty and required that Egypt provide them with food supplies. So Merneptah fulfills that pact. He gives food and provisions to the Hittites, who are really starving because 1 or 2 seasons have failed due to the lack of rain and the famine in the land. We also find that this is the setting for Elimelech and Naomi. This is where they moved to Moab in an effort to evade this famine. And this is where we find in Judges, where we find the Shasu, at least that is what the Egyptian calls them. We find that the Shasu from the south, they come and they camp against southern Judah, and they come to Gaza, and it says that no sustenance is left for Israel. It says neither sheep nor ox nor ass. Now, traditionally, this has often been understood that the raiding, marauding Amalekites just simply took took the booty of the land and taking provisions and looking for spoils of war. But the reality is probably more of sustenance. These are people who are facing famine in their own land, and they come into Judah, which obviously has either better stores, maybe they have some silos, and they have prepared, put aside their tithes for the year of Jubilee, perhaps. So they have a little bit more sustenance. So in times of famine and in times where children are starving, you have these tribes that are going to come into the land, they are going to raid, and they are going to take whatever they can find to sustain their families. And that's really what we find happening right around 1234 BCE. Now, also at this time period, we find that between Deborah and Gideon is really one continuous 87-year era. There really is not a transition, even though there is a 7 years of captivity. That really does not affect the overall Israelite chronology or their history to a great extent. Canaan at this point in time remained part of the Egyptian realm. Merneptah likely led coalition forces against Gideon. And yes, we are going to see that Merneptah and Gideon is probably referred to within Judges, somewhere between Judges 6 and about Judges 9. Refers to the battle there in the Jezreel Valley outside of Megiddo. We also find that Merneptah's inscription at Karnak may depict his battle against Gideon. And this is going to be fun because this may be a very factual picture of what Israel looked like at this battle. And we're going to look at that as we get into the class tonight. Now, one of the things, some of the parallels, last week we looked at the parallels between Judges 5 and 6 in regard to literary style. We're going to continue our parallels tonight between Judges 6 and 7 and that of the Merneptah stele regarding the events that it records. First of all, you find that there is a famine in the land. This is why in Judges 1, as we saw just a moment ago, in Judges 6:1, that there is a famine in the land. And this is why you have the Shashu coming in and raiding from the south. The other thing that you find is that they are attacking, they are desert nomads. They are coming in off the desert because they cannot sustain themselves. And the points that I have listed on these slides are particular points of convergence between the biblical record as well as that of Merneptah. The third parallel that we find is that Israel hid in caves. Interestingly, Merneptah also tells us that the Canaanites hid in caves in order to escape the attacks by the Amalekites. You know, caves provided kind of a natural defense. They were usually up on hills, they were hard to get to. So there was some sort of natural defense in resorting to a cave. The other thing is that you could hope that you would escape detection. About 100 years earlier, during the reign of Horemheb, he also tells us there was an unstable situation in Canaan, this time with Israel being the attacker and the aggressor within the land of Canaan, and warring against the different city-states, forming alliances, and really causing a lot of havoc in Canaan. During that period in time, people resorted to hiding in caves, and now in this time, again, they resort to the same tactical defense. The fifth, and for some reason the fourth has not shown up. There might be a glitch in my program. This is, as you can may have noticed, my first time using this particular application with PowerPoint and allowing each point to appear individually. So if we miss number 4, hopefully it will come back in just a moment. One of the things that we find is that Samson and Shamgar, and I do identify Samson and Shamgar as the same person. There was not codified spelling in ancient times, and there was often regional variance, not only in the way a particular name was spelled, but often in the way a particular name was pronounced. So you could have someone in northern Israel pronounced Shamgar, and someone in Judah pronounced Samson. We find the same type of variance within the tombs of Egypt. You find that one tomb in the same period can have 3 different spellings of the same name. So this is really, spelling was not something that was important to them. They knew who they were talking about, and they were still inscribing it for posterity. So that was not important to them at that time. The other thing that we find, and this is going to be our point 4 that we missed before, is that it says Gideon campaigned near Bethshan, Megiddo, and Yanom, south to Sukkot and Penuel. It's fascinating because these are the very cities that Merneptah attacks. When he comes in on his campaign, he tells us in the Merneptah Stele that he attacked Gaza, he attacked Gezer, Megiddo, and Yanom. If you'll remember, for about 100 years now, the Aparu have been actively campaigning in all of these cities. In previous eras under Ehud, they had sought to make alliances with those cities so that they would play one city against another in an effort to dwindle the playing field as they become stronger and they have a greater population with which to war in Canaan. But you find that Egypt, even at this point in time, still considers the Aparu in Canaan foreigners. They're not native to the land. They are not listed, among the Amu or among the Canaanites of Canaan. They are still considered an outside force. Now, lastly, Merneptah tells us that he attacked the people of Israel. Now, as we saw last week, he says that their seed are no more. They were wiped off the face of the earth, and that all of their women are widows. Well, if you have women that are widows, Israel has not been wiped off the face of the map because women still exist, and more than likely they still have seed that exists. So a lot of that was hyperbole. It was just an exaggerated statement that emphasized Pharaoh's success. Now, we do not know how much success Merneptah really had. It is likely that he had some success with the Canaanites. He probably also had success against Israel. We saw that both Ramesses as well as Thutmose II all deported rebellious Aparu within the land of Canaan. And there's really no reason to suppose Merneptah did not also deport those people who had rebelled against the covenant. Now, I wanted to show, and this is the inset box. I think you can see my mouse right here. This is Merneptah's actual campaign, and this kind of gives you an idea as to the route he took. He came from the south to Gaza, through Ashkelon, Gezer, into the hill country, and then up to Megiddo. Now, where would he have confronted Gideon? It is very likely it was in the plains surrounding Megiddo that he confronted Gideon. It could also have been Gezer. Now, we're going to see why this is the case because of what is written in the inscription and is depicted on the walls of Karnak. This would have been Merneptah's temple in Egypt that recorded his legacy for posterity. And then, as you can see, there is Bethshan, and across the Jordan there is Yanom. And all of these were places that Merneptah attacked and places where Gideon also campaigned. At what point they met each other, we really don't know. It's really a detective case because we're given bits and pieces of the evidence, but not enough to really pull anything together with any sort of absolutes. Now, the other thing that we find, is that Deborah, during her reign or during her judgeship, adopted a new policy in regards to disarmament. During Joshua and the early elders, they knew that if they had followed all of Yahweh's ways, They really did not need to keep armaments among themselves, simply because of the fact that they had chased out all the Canaanites. If they had kept the covenant, there would have been no one in the land that Egypt or any other enemy could have used to leverage against them. But after 200 years of not keeping the covenant, where is a vast population that Egypt or even another nation could leverage against Israel, became very important that they reserved a part of the armaments to defend themselves. So we find that Deborah actually kept a reserve of Gezer's chariots. And this is likely what allowed Gideon to have such incredible success when he met Meneptah. And this is what we find in Judges. We find previously in Judges 4 that Sisera had a host of 900 chariots of iron. Now, we do not know how many of these chariots Deborah had reserved to herself. It could have been 200, but we do know that they did reserve part of the chariot troops or chariot corps to themselves, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Later on, when David comes to the power, he follows Deborah's precedent. When he comes against his enemies, he will destroy all of them. He will destroy a lot of their armaments, but he will keep about 100 or so to himself and for his army, in addition to those that he already had as part of his army. So this becomes a new military policy for Israel and allows incredible success. Now, this is how we know Israel had a chariot corps at the time Gideon confronted Meneptah. What you are looking at in this slide is a depiction from the walls of Karnak. And it depicts Israel having chariots. You know, the depiction here is one of defeat. Israel is defeated by Meneptah's Egyptian army. The interesting thing, so how do we know that this depicts Israel? Well, Frank Yorko is the preeminent scholar and has really written much on this relief. Whether we look at Assyrian inscriptions or Egyptian inscriptions, the custom and the format of the day is that you would often have a very large stone slab, a relief that would tell you the history of what occurred in a particular battle. Pictured around the stone slab, and sometimes with very short descriptions of what was happening, you would have pictures that corresponded to each panel of that particular stone inscription. In Assyria, they gave a little bit more detail on the reliefs that were pictured on the wall. In Karnak, in this particular instance, there is no written inscription saying this is Israel, but rather it parallels the register of the Meneptah inscription, so that the first refers to the Libyans, the second refers to Gezer, all the way down until you get to Israel. And you find that Israel occurs in the fourth register of the story that Meneptah's scribes are telling. Now, what is fascinating also with this is that the people pictured in this relief are wearing red and blue fringes. And you remember when we looked at the Asiatics or the Hebrews in Egypt, or rather in Canaan earlier, remember that that was their traditional dress. So this is something that, again, we see consistently depicts perhaps Epirus, or more specifically, it depicts Israelites. As we come into the Israelite chronology, we saw last week Israel for Deborah, her judgeship lasted from about 1275 to 1227. She coincided with Ramesses II from about 1275 to 1228. And he actually began his reign about 25 years earlier, where he had perhaps had some sort of co-regency with his father, Seti. So we really do not know how much of or how long a co-regency would have lasted. As we come into a time of regress for Israel, a time of rebellion. We find that this is what we're talking about today, the invasion by the Midianites and the Amalekites. The Egyptians would have recognized these as Shasu. The other thing that we find occurs at this time is that there is an invasion of the sea people, which in scripture we read are the Philistines. Now, this is interesting because there is lots of debate among scholarship as to who the Philistines are. According to the biblical record, you find that the Philistines are in Canaan as early as the early Judges era, as well as in Joshua's days. So we find that there are successive waves of invasions by these sea peoples. And we also know, and I'm going to post, you'll see in a moment, a link to one of the latest finds on the Philistines, showing that they show a lot of affinity, that would be similarities, with the people on the island of Cyprus. So we do know that they are a displaced people, whether they're displaced because of famine, or they are displaced because of war, or maybe their population has simply grown so large that it is unsustainable on an island, or there is an epidemic. We really don't know. We do know that these people, when they immigrate and actually when they invade seeking a new homeland, they come with everything on their back. They're fully loaded. Men, women, children, everyone are on the boats as the men march on a land campaign to secure a new homeland for their families. The first wave occurs under the reign of Merneptah, and then the second wave of invasion will occur under Ramesses III. Now, Gideon's judgeship lasted from about 1227 to 1187. This would coincide with Merneptah's 10-year reign from about 1228 to 1218. And then you find that a very unfortunate event occurs for Israel. In 1287, there is a coup among Gideon's sons. And the one son, Abimelech, comes out the more political savvy, and he walks away with the right to rule in Israel, probably pretty much like a king. And this is fascinating because it really reveals the ancient Near Eastern cultures where they had multiple wives. In ancient societies, even though you had a harem or you had multiple wives, there was only one wife that was your wife legally. Her children had the right to succeed in regards to the estate or anything involved or rights of the state. So if Gideon was ruling Israel, it would have been the right of his firstborn son to have taken the judgeship and to have continued with that in Israel. So what you find, though, is that Gideon's son, by a woman that would have been a concubine and had no legal rights, because he showed valor within the family, he conspires among his brethren in Shechem to assume the judgeship in Israel. So we really have the first civil war in Israel's history. This is right around 1187 to 1184. It's about 3 years. And what we find is that over the course of this civil war, his brother Jotham issues a curse against him. And we find that this curse is fulfilled in Shechem. Abimelech is killed in Shechem, and the Migdal is destroyed. So for our purposes, I mean, we can go all through the story, but I really want to focus on the rest of the class this evening. Remember, in the story, a woman drops a millstone on his head and he dies. There is a storming of this Migdal, and the temple of Berith is destroyed, and temples back then served as defensive fortresses. So according to the biblical chronology, this Abimelech would have been killed right at 1185 BCE. Now, why do I drive this point home? because when you want to see the fidelity of the scriptural record with what we know of an independent and unbiased archaeological record that most certainly does not take Abimelech or this portion of Judges into account. And I say that because even the biblical scholarship, remember, places the Exodus, some place the Exodus at 1250, some place it at 1150. So there is no way they are looking for Abimelech or anything with the destruction of Shechem at this point in time. But the archaeological record really doesn't lie, because archaeologists date the destruction of the Migdal to 1180 BCE. So what we see is a 5-year difference between what scripture has and what archaeologists understand the destruction of the Migdal there in Shechem to be. So that is one that provides a great deal of credibility for the story that we have in the book of Judges. As we come into Israel's continuing history, we find that Tola would have been contemporary with Ramesses III. This is also why we see that there is an invasion of sea peoples who, in the Judges story, tells us that Israel now begins to war with the sea peoples. This becomes an active threat. No longer do we see Egypt warring in Canaan. No longer do we really see any other entity active in Canaan. It's really the Philistines from this point out. Ramesses had to fight them coming into the delta. He attacks them and he chases them. He tells us that he repels them back into Canaan and back into Libya. So it's very possible there were two fronts and he repels them. Egypt is safe, but unfortunately Canaan really receives the brunt of this invasion. From here you find that Yair becomes a judge in Israel, and he is now contemporary with Eli. Eli is the high priest. This will coincide with the reign of Ramesses IV, V, and VI. Egypt fears unrest from the enemy. The enemy here will be the Libyans. It will be also the Philistines. And you also find that Egypt's strong monarchy breaks down at this point in time. You begin to have competing dynasties. You have one reigning from Memphis, another one reigning from Tanis. So Egypt is really breaking down into rival factions. These rival factions are helped by the temples. One pharaoh will support one temple and they will ally with each other to the detriment of another. And this political maneuvering occurs for about 120 years until we emerge from the third intermediate period. And that's what we are entering into now, will be the third intermediate period. In 1239, Israel once again falls into captivity, this time to the Philistines and the Ammonites, because they once again rebel against the covenant. Now, when Israel falls, and I put this in here real quick. We'll get into Israel's fall in a minute. This is a depiction of the Sea People's invasion under Ramesses III. And again, there were two invasions. There may have been more, but there are two that are given a lot of attention in Egyptian literature. The link that you see at your bottom right, if you want to look that up, that is one of the latest publications on who the Sea People were and their ties to the island of Cyprus. So I invite you guys to look at that this week. We also find that the ark is captured in 1128 BCE. Now, I used this particular slide. This comes from Steve Rudd, who runs the site Bible.ca, which stands for Canada. I do not agree with all of his dates, but I really liked his map and how he shows the progression of the ark moving throughout the Philistine territory at this point in time. You find that it goes from Ebenezer, It goes to Ashdod, to Gath, to Ekron. Remember, this is where they put the mice in the Ark of the Covenant, and then to Beth Shemesh, and then eventually to Kirjath Jearim, where it stays. But at this point in time, up until this point in time in Israel's history, Shiloh, right here, if you can see my mouse moving, has served as Israel's capital for over 300 years. Shiloh has been where Israel has come to renew the covenant every 7 years. Shiloh has been the source of unity for Israel. When they came to present themselves 3 times a year, it was to Shiloh. This was the place that God had placed his name. With the removal of the Ark of the Covenant, Shiloh becomes desecrated. It no longer has the divine protection. And Israel, this is a closing of a chapter for Israel's history as far as cultic judgments are concerned. As we will see in the succeeding weeks, probably in about 4 weeks from now, a new era and a new chapter will open for Israel with the construction of the permanent temple under Solomon. For Shiloh, the tabernacle, a very temporary dwelling place, had served as its cultic shrine and the place where Israel had resorted. And later on, that will be replaced, as Steve Rudd shows a arrow here. It will eventually come to Jerusalem, and it will stay there until it is finally captured, either by Nebuchadnezzar, or there are some theories that the ark was actually taken to Elephantine, Egypt, or other places by Jeremiah, and its whereabouts are unknown today. Although you do have a lot of documentaries out there claiming to know the location of the Ark of the Covenant. It's just that no one has seen it in recent years, so we're still waiting for that documentary. All right, so we're going to continue on. So this point in time in history, we find that Egypt is weak. Egyptologists refer to this as the third intermediate period. Egypt collapses in a civil war. And this is really a boon for Israel, because never again does Egypt oppress Canaan or the land of Israel as it had during Ramesses II or Thutmose III. This is really Egypt's last stand. There are certain raids that Egypt does under Solomon and under Rehoboam, but never again do we see any Egyptian control over Canaan again. So this was Custer's last stand, so to speak. In 1121 to 1115, Japheth comes to power. He begins the Sixth Conquest campaign. Now, it's very important. Hold on, I'm going to grab a sip here real quick. Remember when the ark was taken captive, that Eli died. Israel really dwells without a high priest. Samuel serves as an interim high priest. Even though he is a Levite, he is simply not of the seed of Aaron. So he's more of an interim high priest at this point in time. You find that Samuel and Japheth really collaborate during this time period. And we're going to see why and how we see their collaboration in just a minute. And often, you know, it is in those details in scripture where, like Perry Mason or Sherlock Holmes, you can uncover so much more of the story. So, and this is where we find the rest of the story. And it relies in it is really founded in where Israel resorts to their capital city during this interim period where Shiloh has been forsaken and the entire countryside is not safe. Let me go back to the previous slide for a moment. If you look right here, do you see that from Shiloh all the way over to Ebenezer, to Ashdod, Gath, Ekron, Beth Shemesh? Do you see that the vast territory that the Philistines were raiding, and how much Israel was under attack, they had lost this entire area to the Philistines, places that they had actually lived for 200 years, perhaps even longer. They have now lost to Philistine control, whether it's by tribute or it's by marauding bands that capture Israelites and take them as bond servants. We really don't know that side of the history, but it does say that they served the Philistines, to whatever extent serve can mean. So just notice that all of this in here is very unstable, and it is very unsafe for Israel during those years. All right, we're going to fastly move forward. So Mizpah then becomes a point of safety for Israel to meet during Jephthah's and Samuel's judgeship. From 1115 to 1090, we have Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and all of these judges are going to coincide with Samuel. Samuel would have been a very young boy when he began counseling Israel. He may have been as young as 10 years of age. So Samuel began very early in his life. From 1090 to 1050, it is now captivity just to the Philistines. The Philistines have now made their mark on the land. They are permanent residents. They are no longer illegal aliens, and they have chased out or weakened all other competing sources of power. So what you really see is that it really comes down to just Israel and Philistines vying for the land of Canaan at this particular point in time. Now, this is where I wanted to show Mizpah. If you look here, now most scholars will say that Shiloh was a district separate than Shechem. I find that Shiloh was probably a district within Shechem. So there is some scholarly debate on that. But notice that if Shechem had been the capital city, or Shiloh, no matter which place you want to assign it, that Israel would have resorted across the Jordan over to Mizpah for safety. And this allowed Israel the ability to not only appear for the 3 annual holy days, but to discuss matters of national security, to plan campaign strategies, and also to renew the covenant. 1 Samuel 7, 3 through 5 refers to the covenant renewal. So when we are looking at this point in time in Israel's history, just know that Judges 12 overlaps and coincides with 1 Samuel 7. So when you can't always look at everything separate. Just because they are in separate books, it doesn't mean that they're actually second documents. They're documents that have been put together for us today in separate books, but they are still recording the same history at the same time. So Japheth had incredible success, and this is what scripture tells us of Japheth's success. It says, and he smote them from Aor even until you come to Minnith, even 20 cities, and to the plain of the vineyards, with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. So Japheth subdues the children of Ammon, but we're going to also see that Samuel has incredible success at this point in time. You know, you often think of the priest simply being the spiritual leaders, people who advise regarding Temeh and Tehor, which would be clean and unclean. But you find that they had a much broader role at this point in time in Israel's history. And we find that they actually retain this role through the monarchy, and we'll address that in just a moment. So with Samuel, this is what scripture tells us of Samuel's success. It says, then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shin, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, so far Yahweh has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they came no more unto the coast of Israel. And the hand of Yahweh was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron even unto Gath, and all the coast thereof did Israel deliver out of the hands of the Philistines. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. So this would have been a very long judgeship for Samuel. I speculate that it ran about 102 years. We are not given the details, but when you align the rest of the chronology up, it really allows for somewhere between 92 and 102 years for Samuel to have judged Israel. But notice that Samuel had a hand in the wars against the Philistines. Samuel took out cities that belonged to the Philistines and restored the coast of Israel. You find throughout Israel's history, even unto the monarchy, that the priesthood always served, had a military support. Sometimes it was in opposing the king. When the king overstepped his grounds, the priesthood would work with the elders to depose a king and to establish another king of Judah in his stead. So this is something that we find is within the realm of the priesthood, even at this early point in time. Samuel should really, the Septuagint refers to Samuel as, divides it into First and Second Kings, which is a much better description of the book of Samuel rather than saying, indicating that's a book of Samuel. We know that Samuel, Gad, as well as Nathan all had a hand in writing the book of Samuel. So what we are looking at this point in time is that Judges 12 is probably written by the judges' scribes, and Samuel at this point in time is really a book of Kings that is now being written by the priesthood, the school of the prophets, and it is within a priestly source. So now at this point in time, we come to the end of Samuel's judgeship, the end of Japheth's judgeship. Samuel would have ruled Israel, or rather judged Israel, for about 7 years. In 1058, Israel comes to Samuel and they ask for a king. 7 years later, you find that Saul is installed as king over Israel, and he begins Israel's 7th conquest campaign. In 1032, David is installed over Judah. Now remember, when David comes to power, there is a civil unrest because of the way that Saul died. Not all of the nation is ready to follow David because Saul had chased him for a number of years throughout the desert. So for parts of Israel, there's animosity for David. Some of them follow Saul's son Mephibosheth, and others follow David. Now, a very interesting synchronism that we have as far as chronology is concerned occurs right around 1013 BCE. This would have been about 10 years after David was established on Israel's throne. Now, what is fascinating with this is that it gives us a very particular ability to date Psalm 60 verse 1. So this would have been very early in David's reign. But the gold nugget or the gem in this psalm is not just the content of the psalm, but the dating of it. Because David tells us it was written when David went forth against Mesopotamia, and Aram Zeboah, and Joab smote Edom. Now, this is important because we have inscriptions from Ashur-Rabi of Assyria stating that he attacked the Alamu Arameans. Now, there were portions of the Assyrian Empire, not Syria. And it's always difficult when you are, I'm sorry, hold on just a minute, guys. The dogs are barking here. It's always difficult when you talk about Syria, because there's Syria to the north of Israel and Assyria to the northeast of Israel. So Ashur-Rabi would have ruled the Assyria. And they came in and they attacked the Arameans. And there were these border towns between the two that were really going back and forth, trading hands for about 200 years. And we have an inscription, and let me just share with you what that inscription is. And this is not an inscription, all of it. I'm just giving you the gist of what the inscription says. So we're just going to go ahead and read this real quick. It says, some Assyrian settlements on the middle Euphrates were lost to the Arameans as they were able to cross the river and establish a network of autonomous but interrelated settlements that began to encroach on the Assyrian heartland. The king of Aram is named by David. He is either Hadadrezer Zobah in southern Syria or a northern Aram in or near Henegblot. So Henegblot would have been part of Syria, a stronghold, I believe, of Mitanni. I did not have time to refresh my memory on some of that, so bear with me through that. Now, we also find that this king's authority continued to stretch as far west as Habur River, as recorded on a cylinder of Belaris, a Sangu or governor of Sadakini, somewhat contradicting the picture of Assyria in retreat and the decline as painted elsewhere. So what we have here is a direct parallel. David tells us that at the time that the Assyria came in and raided the Arameans, at the time that this confrontation took place, when Hadadrezer of Zebulun was in power, that this is when he wrote a particular psalm. So this also allows us to date David's reign. And it would probably have been about 10 years into his reign. Now, one of the last things, or this is the last thing that we're going to look at this evening, is that the progression of Torah observance within Israel. We saw that under Deborah's judgeship, for the first time, Israel stops eating pork. For the first time, Israel begins interring, or rather burying her dead in a very simple manner without all of the pagan customs that they had used formally. Another thing that we see under David is that when they made offerings, or when they had perhaps a little shrine within their own home, they are always unpictured. It has been speculated that these potteries, this is called a pottery ark, that they represented and depicted Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, or perhaps the tabernacle. They had recesses within them that coincide with the first temple. So the fascinating point is that they are unpictured, unlike those pottery arks that we have from other nations, where they have ornate depictions of animals all over them. And these are very plain and very simple, which would lean support towards a people that were worshiping one God, and they were not polytheistic at this point in time. So this is going to conclude the end of chapter 11 for the book club. I'm going to open it up to any comments or questions. The next class that we have next week, we are going to get into the reign of David and Solomon and the early monarchy. And then we are going to transition into the effacement judgment, to some prophecy, and get into more of the prophetic and symbolic things that are within the Torah that we can learn and glean from today. So any comments or questions, I'm going to go ahead and bring it back. And great to have you guys join me this evening. I hope you have enjoyed this series on the Canaan Conquest. I know I have enjoyed it, and have, I think every time I deal with the material, I learn more. And I hope that is the case for you as well. The internet provides so many great resources and so many opportunities to learn in different directions. So any comments or questions, guys? All right. If not, I hope you guys will join me at 10:30 tomorrow morning for Roots of Faith, and that is 10:30 Central. Otherwise, we will see you guys next week. And next week's class, of course, will be September 9th. All right. So, all right. Well, if there's no question, I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. Great to see you guys and have a fantastic week. And I am so glad, I must say, I'm very, very grateful. You know, we always talk about praise reports. I'm very grateful that we did indeed miss the hurricane this week. It did go to Florida. I haven't heard of a lot of damage, mainly power outages. The blessing for us anytime, because we are located near Baton Rouge. So the blessing for us is that anytime a hurricane hits Florida, Alabama, and doesn't really hit us, we get a drop in temperature and a drop of humidity. So today was about 10 degrees cooler than normal, as well as it was far less humid. You weren't wearing your weather today, so that was very nice. So Baton Rouge is still continuing its cleanup. Thank you guys for all of your support, whether it's through prayer, contributions, or getting in, rolling up your sleeves and helping out. Really appreciate that. And all the people that have come together. It has just really been heartwarming. So, so Cindy's had it cool her way as well. So, all right, guys. Well, we will see you tomorrow morning and again next week. Shabbat Shalom.